Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed, and this is our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism. Today, we have a special guest, Ludovic Hood, the Senior Advisor to Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, who is the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism. Ludovic, welcome.
Great to be with you, Omar. Thanks for this opportunity to discuss my office's work.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. Would you like to introduce yourself and your office?
With pleasure, Omar. So my name is Ludovic Hood. I'm a career U.S. diplomat. I've been working for the State Department for almost 20 years, overwhelmingly focused on the Middle East, where I have served 3 times, as well as one assignment in Europe, which was also focused on Middle East policy. For the last 3 years, I have been assigned to the Office of the Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Antisemitism, where I serve as the Senior Advisor to the Envoy, who is currently the renowned historian of the Holocaust, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, currently on leave from Emory University. Our office is a small office set up by an act of Congress 20 years ago. And the purpose is to help shape and lead the State Department's diplomacy with governments overseas in various efforts to combat anti-Semitism. And we have traditionally focused largely on Europe. And in the recent years, particularly since I had the pleasure of working in this office, we've also expanded the focus onto some Middle Eastern countries, which we can talk about later. And obviously, in the context of the significant surge in anti-Semitism around the world over the past 7 months, we've had to increase our staffing and our efforts as we contend with an alarming spike in anti-Semitism around the world.
As I always start with one question I ask all my guests, and that is, what is the definition of anti-Semitism?
Omar, there are many people, both experts and lay people, who are very uncomfortable with the notion of having to define forms of prejudice and hatred. I think in 99% of cases, it's pretty evident when someone has crossed the line into stereotyping or expressing intolerance or hatred. There's a famous 1964 Supreme Court case in the U.S. Regarding obscenity, and Justice Potter Stewart used the famous phrase, "I know it when I see it." And I think that is quite relevant in the context of defining racism or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. I think honest, objective people, if they sit back for a second, in 99.9% of cases will say to themselves, yes, that is problematic, that is stereotyping, that is a trope, that is discriminatory, that is hateful. Now, putting that aside, the State Department has indeed embraced a non-binding working definition, which was established following over a decade of polling and discussion, overwhelmingly by European governments and European civil society groups, under the auspices of a small multilateral organization called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And they had a non-binding working definition of anti-Semitism, which is 2 fairly simple sentences, which I think most people, maybe all people, would find fairly uncontroversial. I quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews, rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And that is it. Now, this working definition does include a number of illustrative examples that are meant to be nothing but examples. And as the text notes, the examples very much depend on the context of the statement. And for some reason, a couple of these have become controversial and have resulted in the entire definition becoming controversial for some people. Fortunately, over 40 UN member states have embraced this non-binding working definition, and we continue to encourage other countries to embrace it. And the point being is it's a tool to help entities, whether law enforcement trying to better understand how to define a hate crime, or universities or schools trying to introduce guidelines for what might be language that is hurtful to some people. So it's not designed to be codified and to become the law of the land, per se. You can't do that when you're trying to define a prejudice. It's besides the point, frankly. So it's a working tool, and one that, as I said, the U.S. government has embraced, and we encourage others to do likewise.
Now that we went through the definition, and as you said, it's at least there is a working definition to help entities to navigate through the mechanism of combating anti-Semitism. But Ludwig, we have seen anti-Semitism in action and in practice post-October 7 attack. I mean, the attack in itself has shown that anti-Semitism is not merely a rhetoric, but it can be violent, and the action can be taken to lead to the murdering of the Jews. I mean, can you take us to the scene of anti-Semitism post-October 7?
Well, as you correctly note, Omar, the Hamas attack on Israel triggered an outbreak of anti-Semitism, and particularly in parts of Europe and parts of North America, that I think stunned most people, obviously above all Jews in those countries. Within hours, actually, there were demonstrations in cities like London and Sydney that seemed to be celebrating the Hamas attack and contained slogans and imagery that crossed the line into Jew hatred. And as anyone who follows the global media knows, this has continued for the past 7 months or so. Now, we are in our office stepping up engagement with governments across Europe, North and South America, and further afield, including Australia, which my colleague Aaron Kiak, our Deputy Special Envoy, will visit very soon. In many cases, governments have been saying the right things and taking steps to reassure their Jewish communities. Unfortunately, in other cases, we've seen some leaders in parts of, for example, Latin America and South Africa, use language publicly to describe the situation in Gaza that crosses the line into anti-Semitism, in our view, particularly when invoking the Nazis or Hitler to describe certain statements or policies or actions. And we have condemned and called those out. One of our mantras is that anti-Semitism needs to be called out, condemned unequivocally whenever and wherever it occurs, and we continue to do that both publicly and privately in our diplomacy. So that continues. The disturbing, if not alarming thing is that in some countries, it feels that anti-Semitism has almost overnight become somewhat acceptable or mainstreamed into some discourse. And this is something that governments and civil society and broad coalitions of different groupings need to understand and need to confront by speaking up. In some countries we see, particularly behind the scenes, we see people struggling with how to make that happen. Other countries have some way to go. But all in all, we are cognizant of the challenge, and we are doing our best to work with foreign governments, including through our own embassies and consulates, which are our force multipliers, of course, being a tiny office. And we'll continue to do our best.
Ambassador Lipstadt had a very firm response after the attack. I think our listeners need to listen once again to how that response was. What impact did it have? And I mean, to add to that, what are the concerns? Is it something limited to current events, or as you said, it's being mainstreamed, normalized, and this might go beyond control?
That's a question perhaps better posed to an academic than a government official working on these issues. But I'll do my best to provide some context. Again, speaking as a generalist diplomat, currently assigned to this office, I think first and foremost, as most of your listeners will know, anti-Semitism is not only a old problem; it's an ancient problem. It's a 2,000-year-old problem. It's called the oldest hatred for a reason, and its roots go back 2 millennia. Different forms of anti-Semitism are, in some ways, part and parcel of a lot of traditional European thinking and ideology in different forms. It has its own manifestations in other parts of the world, including in the parts of the Arab world, particularly after the Second World War and the establishment of the State of Israel. So it's not just a decades-old problem; it's a centuries-old problem. And it goes without saying that, up until the founding of the State of Israel, the Jewish people did not have a homeland per se for millennia. And the history of the Jewish people, for the most part, has been one of uncertainty, fear, and all too often persecution, exile, and of course in the 20th century, mass murder, genocide in our grandparents' lifetime too. So it's an ancient and lingering problem. I think it's still confounding to some people how the extent to which it exploded after Israel was attacked, even before Israel started responding militarily inside the Gaza Strip. Something was triggered in different ways, leading to outbursts of different forms of contemporary anti-Semitism across Europe and the Americas. So that's a little bit of historical context coming from someone who is not a historian, and still has so much to learn himself about this problem. And every time I read a new article by one of the hundreds of experts on this, I learn something new, obviously, as I'm sure you do, Omar.
A question that I get a lot, Ludwig. When I spoke to the European coordinator on combating anti-Semitism, the German coordinator, and I would like to ask you this question. It was also asked by my Jewish friends, is that what tools do you have to combat anti-Semitism? What are the tools you are using?
Well, we as a governmental entity, particularly a foreign policy governmental entity, we are just one narrow slice of the array or the coalition of different actors that needs to play a role in combating not just anti-Semitism, but any form of prejudice or intolerance. So our tools are all within the diplomatic, and that's what we do at the U.S. State Department. We are the foreign ministry equivalent of the United States, and there are certain realms that we either cannot or do not fit easily into. Being government representatives. But our tools, to use your term, Omar, include working with overseas governments to put in place certain official structures or mechanisms that can perhaps help fighting anti-Semitism. So we continue to encourage other countries to appoint and empower national coordinators to deal with anti-Semitism. We continue to engage some governments to think about drafting and adopting and implementing national strategies to counter anti-Semitism. We in the US launched our first ever such national strategy exactly 1 year ago, which was after many European countries had already done so. And I should pause here. You mentioned the European coordinator. She is a essential partner for us, an inspiring partner, and has done incredible work within the context of the European Union to sort of set norms and encourage other countries on their individual domestic anti-Semitism strategies. We also encourage governments to be clear-eyed and unequivocal in calling out anti-Semitism, because it can be a slippery slope. If you tolerate certain innocent-seeming tropes or stereotypes, it can lead to worse. And as with any form of prejudice, you have to nip it in the bud and be clear-eyed and unequivocal and honest about what you're seeing and confronting early on. So we certainly encourage governments, not just national, but also at the subnational level and at the legislative level too, to play a role in all of this. So those are just some examples of how we engage diplomatically with governments on a bilateral basis. And then, of course, Omar, there's the multilateral piece. And yes, absolutely, we work hard to engage different parts of the UN system. I've already mentioned the European Commission, the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is another very important, I believe it's a 45-member forum for keeping this issue on the radar, including in the context of East Europe and Russia. So we do spend considerable time working with our respective colleagues who cover those different multilateral entities.
Away from Europe and the United States, Ludwig, the Middle East, what anti-Semitism in Europe is rising, in the United States it is also rising, but there's, I don't know, correct me if I am mistaken here, are there any efforts for any type of outreach to Middle Eastern countries, to Arabic-speaking audiences, to work on anti-Semitism in these countries? I will be brutally honest here. When I spoke to UNESCO, which works in many countries, it's a part of the UN system, they simply said, we cannot work in the Middle East on anti-Semitism. It's too risky for them. So what have you been doing on this matter? I know that you have been involved in this type of outreach, but I think it would be important to learn more.
The easy answer is that we have been doing a lot of engagement in the Middle East and continue to do so. The current crisis around Gaza notwithstanding. There have been a number of changes in some Arab countries that have opened the door to have productive conversations about ending ignorance or ending suspicion or ending hatred about Jews and Judaism. Those two major developments would be one, the Abraham Accords from late 2020, whereby 4 Arab governments agreed to normalize or establish relations with the State of Israel. And then the second theme or development is the effort by some Arab leaders, particularly in the Gulf, to move forward with ambitious reform projects to not only diversify their economies, but to change even societal and social attitudes and, in some cases, restrictions, partly with a view to helping these countries or economies become part of either the global economy or to become part of an integrated regional economy, including, in many cases, as publicly stated, by both Abraham Accords and non-Abraham Accords countries with Israel. So these developments have all seen both indigenous efforts in some countries to start removing anti-Semitic content from official discourse, from sermons, from textbooks, and other places. Sometimes it's encouragement by outside actors such as the United States that helps to nudge some governments to be more proactive removing that kind of content in the media and textbooks and so forth. But we've seen some progress in a number of Arab countries in terms of reducing the acceptability of anti-Semitic discourse and content. We fully understand that the current crisis in Gaza has necessitated a pause of sorts in some of the work that we do, but I will say conversations continue, and Dr. Lipstadt and I, whose very first trip together was to Saudi Arabia almost 2 years ago, look forward to returning to that part of the world, hopefully this year.
And in the news, also in the op-ed of Thomas Friedman, he said that Israel has to choose. I know this is a political question. I'm not concerned about politics here, but I want to look into the question of, is there a potential that Saudi Arabia can be included in a future collaboration to combat anti-Semitism in the Middle East, and whether this has been impacted by October 7 attack?
Separate to regional politics and separate to any talk of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, I would essentially repeat what I just said. Some Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, have made progress removing anti-Semitic content and discourse from textbooks, from sermons, from official discourse, in a way that we think is productive and, of course, applaud and seek to encourage. And we don't see any indication that the last 6-7 months have seen a resurgence of officially sanctioned anti-Semitism. That's obviously reassuring. And we look forward to continuing the private diplomatic discussions that we continue to have. And as I said, we're hoping that Ambassador Lipstadt can return to the kingdom in the not too distant future to meet with not only government officials, but also civil society.
I have probably asked you this question, Ludovic, probably in a previous engagement with you, there are many offices in Europe and the United States, I mean, including your office. And there the simple question comes like, these offices exist, but there is still rise in anti-Semitism. I mean, what are the challenges that you face? What are the problems that you think are preventing such entities from having effective operations to reduce anti-Semitism?
The reason this office was set up by Congress 20 years ago was in response to a perception that after several decades of relative absence of anti-Semitism in Europe, the 90s and beyond, started to see clear signs that anti-Semitism had crept back into some aspects of European society, culture, politics, etc. So this office, and I believe other offices in Europe, were set up, responding to what has been a creeping growth of different forms of both old and contemporary anti-Semitism. I think, as with, asking about my office, as with any of the many different single issue offices that we have at the State Department, we are very modest about what we can do despite our best efforts. There are, massive historical and contemporary challenges and crises and, above all, conflicts out there that have an impact on people's thinking, sometimes tens of millions of people's ways of thinking about the world and about issues, and also about how they think about other peoples and groupings, sometimes in negative ways, tragically. So we are, we are cognizant of that. We are acutely aware that even as our leadership in this office has successfully grown our office and made our impact in the State Department more meaningful, we are dealing with what Ambassador Lipstadt calls a tsunami of anti-Semitism. And we will continue to do our best, with the blessing of the Secretary of State, our ultimate boss, as well as the White House, to further our mission.
Recently, there has been lots of engagement from academics, research centers who are trying to mitigate, understand, and combat the recent rise of antisemitism. And I think it's important to hear from you as a diplomat in such an office, as a policymaker, what recommendations do you have to academics when they mitigate and try to understand antisemitism?
I don't think we or I have any guidance for academics. I mean, there are so many angles to anti-Semitism. It's perhaps in some ways the most complex of all forms of hatred or prejudice, given its roots and given its different manifestations in different parts of the world, within different religions. It needs to be understood, dissected, analyzed from numerous angles. I do my best to stay informed, but there's, I'm using the word tsunami again. There's been a tsunami of excellent essays, op-eds, journal articles, and other such publications in the last 6 months alone. And some of them contain gems, brilliant observations, and in some cases, good recommendations. But in many cases, it feels to me that, some of the recommendations are generational in nature and not something that can be implemented overnight. Getting people to change their minds or to shake off a preconceived notion or preconceived ideology is it's not an overnight exercise.
Another question, Ludwig. When it comes, I know your office is based on an international reach, and it's not related to domestic matters in the United States. So let's talk about something outside the US, which is the recent rise also of protest in universities. I mean, this question has been asked several times. they say, what is anti-Semitism and what is free speech? Where do we draw the line?
There are several elements to that question. Obviously, campus activism, campus unrest is front page news here in the US, has been for the past 2 weeks or so. But there's also been significant incidents in some other countries that we, and particularly our embassies and consulates, are tracking, keeping an eye on. Stepping back for a second, Omar, obviously, it goes without saying that criticism of any government's specific policies, including that of the State of Israel, policies, actions, rhetoric, criticizing that is not anti-Semitism. No serious person would claim that. On the other hand, the question you're posing is about some of the things we're seeing playing out on campuses. And there have been numerous examples, which I'm sure you've seen on social media feeds as well as in the news, of some slogans, of some signs, of some chants that first and foremost make many Jewish people uncomfortable, and secondly, in some, if not many cases, have crossed the line into being anti-Semitic. There are some words like Zionist or Zio that, whilst it is fine to provide a productive, informed critique of Zionism, however one defines that, it's very clear if you look at many videos that I've seen myself in recent weeks and months that calling someone a Zio or a Zionist is clearly a foil, a cover for making sweeping statements about Jews as a whole. The other separate issue is, and this is way beyond what we do at the State Department, but it's a fairly simple matter for any of us who work in institutions and understand the rule of law, or who have children heading off to university soon. Universities have codes of conduct. They have rules to allow for a safe learning environment where all points of views are welcome. And as a growing number of universities have made clear through public statements in recent weeks and months, and I will say, as someone who has a degree from Columbia itself started sending us alumni messages in the last couple of days. Columbia is one of those that has made clear that there needs to be some boundaries for what constitutes appropriate expressions of free debate, free expression, and what crosses the line into behavior that is clearly either unsafe for the community as a whole, non-conducive to studying and taking exams, or outright threatening and dangerous. Now, each and every private university has to make their own decisions on this, and obviously we're seeing this play out. Even as you and I speak right now, there are things happening on campuses from Australia through to Canada, and obviously here in the US, happening right now, involving conversations amongst university administrators and with outside law enforcement and ministries of education about how to deal with certain things. In an ideal world, we can find ways to encourage all young people to step back and try and understand each and every crisis in the world a little bit more in a more detailed way, and make sure that they're channeling their activism in ways that are not only productive but actually on the basis of being adequately informed.
I have seen myself, for example, in Paris, incidents where a Jewish student was called Zionist, you don't belong here, and was prevented from entering the university. but I also get this during my teaching. I teach at the university, and some students expect me to pick sides. It's a very complicated matter, but it's not the topic of our discussion. In less than a minute, Ludwig, what recommendations do you have? Apart from the recommendations to academics, but what recommendations that should come from your office to policymakers and to whoever is listening to us?
I mean, there are so many potential audiences to address recommendations at. Again, as the State Department, the de facto foreign ministry for the United States, our main audience is our counterparts overseas, governments, and indirectly other such governing entities, whether parliaments or subnational actors. It's to be clear-eyed and unequivocal in recognizing and condemning anti-Semitism. It's to figure out coalitions within society, both including officials and civil society, to bring people together, to have conversations that help overcome misunderstanding and suspicion. And it's to increasingly to have governments think about how education, national curricula can be used to teach about Jews and Judaism and Jewish heritage, again, with the goal of reducing misunderstanding and discrimination.
Ludwig, thank you very much for your insights.
My pleasure. I look forward to continuing our collaboration with your program.
This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.